Welcome to Subtaget Live. My name is Tom and I'm here today with Slim, talking about embracing empathy. Slim, can you tell us about what you do on a daily basis?
Sure. My primary role is to help small business CEOs grow and develop as a leader. So what I do is help them kind of guide them along that journey. Yeah. And a major portion of that journey requires them to develop empathy, both for themselves and also other people. So that's what I focus on a day-to-day basis.
Can anyone learn to be empathic?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. And I think it goes back to the idea that most people, when they hear the word empathy, they immediately think about the idea that empathy is something that happens automatically, involuntarily. Like you watch a singer sing or an actor act and you just immediately feel that sense of connection or oneness. That is certainly one way in which empathy could be realized, but there's also another way, which is where you deliberately practice realizing your empathy, right? So if you ever had a friend that you initially didn't like, maybe you even hated that person, right? But over time, you made an effort to connect with them, and through some trials and ordeals, you eventually got close to that person enough that you become good friends, right? Yeah. So if you've ever had an experience like that, you have experienced deliberately realizing your empathy such that you can become, have a more intimate relationship with another person. Yeah. So absolutely, you could learn to do that on a deliberately practiced basis.
Okay. So I was in Sapphire Now in May.
Yes.
And SAP's CEO, Bill McDermott, he talked about empathy in his keynote as being very important to SAP. And customers talking to SAP about a lack of empathy towards the customer. So how could we help them to have more empathy?
Yes. Let me answer that question in a slightly roundabout way, and I'll talk about two things. One is mutuality, and the other is conversation. So I've been applying my own theory of empathy to leadership and organizations for about almost 4 years now. And the most humbling lesson I've learned is that everybody thinks everybody else lacks empathy.
Yeah.
Right? So, and this doesn't even have to go to an organizational setting. You can see this everywhere. Husband thinks wife lacks empathy. Wife thinks husband lacks empathy. Classic case, right? So that in and of itself, I think, is a useful sign. At least it's been for me and also the people that I help grow as a leader. Whenever you start thinking that somebody else lacks empathy, that's a sign for you to think that potentially, and with high probability, that exact person also thinks of the same thing about you.
Yeah.
They think you lack empathy just as you think they lack empathy. Right? So becoming aware of this, I think, is important to the second thing. So the first thing is the idea that there's a mutual kind of involvement required for empathy to develop in relationships. It's not just a one-sided thing.
Yeah.
The second thing I'm going to talk about is conversation. And the lead into that is a lot of times when there is kind of a service provider and customer relationship, the kinds of communication that happens between them tends to be very unilateral.
Yeah.
Meaning, the service provider has already made a decision. We're going to release the software, we're going to have these features, whatever it is. And even if that has been a part of a exploratory process of design thinking or whatever it is, even if they've spent years doing whatever research work they have, there is a tendency for a lot of companies to eventually kind of use a unilateral channel of communication to engage customers. Now, oftentimes when customers are in a situation where they think a service provider lacks empathy, not always, but many times it means that they're in some state of anxiety or fear. Right? Maybe they're afraid that the software, you're going to make your software go away or make it obsolete. So maybe they're afraid that they can no longer use your software, or maybe they're not going to add the feature they really, really need. Whatever the reason may be, they're in some state of anxiety or fear. Right? That's highly correlated to people thinking other people lack empathy when they feel that way. If they're in that situation, you go into that context with the mindset of I'm going to unilaterally communicate something, whether it's, I'm really sorry, but we've made this decision that we're going to only have this feature. Even if that feature is so well intended, simply by virtue of the fact that the customer is in a state of fear and anxiety, and also by virtue of the fact that you are taking a kind of a unilateral mode of communication, that conversation is going to go nowhere. Right? A metaphor that I often use is the performance review. Right? Anybody who's gone through performance review knows how it feels like to go through a performance review.
True.
You're in a state of fear and anxiety. Because you got to defend yourself to like get your salary up or something, like, and you're afraid they're not going to give you a raise or they're going to take away some perks or whatever it is. You're in a state of fear and anxiety. And if the boss comes into that conversation with the decision made that, well, I'm going to take away his perks or not going to give him a raise, that conversation is going to go nowhere, right? Exact same kind of situation. So to remedy the situation, two things has to happen. First of all, you need to go into this conversation with an explicit strategy that your focus, first and foremost, is to cater to their anxiety and fear. That's your first goal, right? You can't simply go in there and tell them what to do. You first have to do whatever it takes to get the other person to a place where they feel safe, that even if something that they don't want to happen in the future is going to happen, something gives and they feel sufficiently heard and understood that they're in a place where they can engage in a conversation, number one. Second, you have to be yourself put in a place where you haven't completely made up your mind yet. You're willing to be somewhat influenced, even if you have some boundaries and constraints, you're willing to engage the other in a conversation, such that if they say, well, if you say, well, I understand that this is a really important feature, and if we get rid of it, something bad will happen to you, we're stuck because we don't know what to do. There are other business constraints that we have that forces us to do this, but we're willing to work something out with you. That's a very different stance than simply saying this is this take it or leave it kind of a thing, right? So going in with that mindset and engaging them in a genuine conversation where you're willing to give something, and they're also willing to have that conversation where they're not simply going to be in a place of fear and anxiety, they're also willing to contribute some ideas where they're also willing to give a little bit. And so there's some constructive conversation that happens between them. That may not ultimately completely solve the problem, but that will keep the relationship strong, right? So even if you don't completely solve the problem, you are building a relationship where you're building empathy together, and then a level of trust is also being built, such that down the road, you're also going to do the same thing with each other. And once again, even if not all problems get solved, you're still building the relationship. That's a slightly different focus in which to engage the other person than simply a kind of a unilateral communication.
Okay, so it's really important to have trust between SAP, the customers, have empathy from both sides as well. And that's how we can take the next step towards being empathic for the customer.
Absolutely,
okay. I want to thank you for this interview.
Sure.
And we'll see you next time.
Absolutely, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.